The rain fell hard on the makeshift military base outside the small German town of Hagen. It was April 1945, and the war in Europe was coming to an end, though nobody knew it would happen quite so suddenly. Captain James Whitmore stood in his office, holding a personnel file that made him frown. Outside, the sounds of trucks, shouting soldiers, and the distant rumble of artillery filled the cold German spring air. "This has to be some kind of mistake," Whitmore said, looking at his lieutenant, a thin man named Derek who stood rigidly at attention. "Tell me this is wrong." "No, sir, it's correct," Derek replied carefully. "She arrived this morning. Assignment came down from division headquarters." Whitmore opened the file again. The photograph showed a woman in uniform, dark hair pulled back severely, with steady eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. Her name was First Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, age 28. Below her picture were the words, "Medical Officer, Field Surgical Unit." "A woman," Whitmore muttered, more to himself than to Derek. "They're sending us a woman doctor." "Yes, sir, she's already requested to see you." Whitmore sighed and set the file down on his desk. The base was chaos enough without this complication. General Omar Bradley's forces were closing in from the west. The Russians were coming from the east. Caught between them was the Ruhr pocket, a massive German industrial region now surrounded by Allied troops. Inside were roughly 500,000 German soldiers, Nazi officers, civilians, and God knew what else. The whole area was a powder keg waiting to explode, and Whitmore's job was to coordinate the surrender and maintain order among the thousands of soldiers and refugees flooding through their sector. And now, somebody in their infinite wisdom had decided to send him a female medical officer. "Send her in," Whitmore said, not bothering to hide his irritation. Sarah Mitchell knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. She was taller than Whitmore expected, with a composed bearing that immediately struck him as unusual. She wore her uniform properly, though it was evident she'd had it tailored to fit a woman's frame, something that seemed almost rebellious in its normalcy. She saluted crisply. "First Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell reporting for duty, sir," she said. Her voice was calm and professional, with just the faintest hint of a Boston accent. "At ease, Lieutenant," Whitmore said, not returning the salute. "I'm Captain Whitmore. This is unexpected. I wasn't informed that a female officer would be joining this unit." "My orders came down through the medical corps, sir," Sarah replied. She remained standing, her hands clasped behind her back. "I was completing surgical training when I was reassigned here. I understand this is a field surgical unit. I'm prepared to work as part of the medical team." Whitmore studied her. She was calm, sure of herself, completely unflustered by his obvious coldness toward her. That somehow made it worse. "We don't have facilities for a female officer," he said. "We're not set up for that. We're in the middle of a combat zone." "I'm aware of that, sir," Sarah replied. "I don't require special facilities. I require a surgical table and medical supplies. I'm qualified to do my job." "This isn't a hospital, Lieutenant. This is a forward operating base. We have wounded soldiers coming in constantly. We have German prisoners. We have refugees. The last thing my men need is distraction." Something flickered across Sarah's face. Not anger, but a kind of determined resignation, as if she'd heard this before and knew there was nothing she could say that would matter. "I understand, sir. When would you like me to begin?" "I'll have Lieutenant Derek show you where you can. Settle. Keep out of the way until we know what we're doing with you." "Yes, sir." She saluted again and turned to leave. "Mitchell," Whitmore called out as she reached the door. She turned back. "Sir." "You're probably going to regret this assignment. It's going to be rough out here." "I'm a surgeon, sir," Sarah said quietly. "I went to medical school during a depression and a war. I've already done difficult things." She left before he could respond. That evening in the mess tent, Sarah experienced what would become a familiar ritual. She sat alone at a table while the other officers, all male, gathered in clusters around the room. Every so often, one of them would glance her way and make a comment that got quiet laughs. She heard fragments. "What's next, female pilots?" And the whole army's going soft, and the inevitable laughter. A young soldier named Private Tommy Reeves, barely 20 and still with acne on his face, worked up the courage to approach her with a message from some of the other officers. He was red-faced and embarrassed about it. "They want to know if you need help carrying things," he stammered. "On account of, well." "Tell them I can carry my own equipment," Sarah said quietly. But thank you for asking, Private. The private nodded and hurried away, leaving Sarah alone with her coffee. The next morning, before dawn, Sarah reported to the medical tent. The captain who ran it was a gray-haired man named Morrison, about 60 years old, with the weathered face of someone who'd been a doctor through the last war, and this one too. He looked at Sarah with something between curiosity and concern. "You're the female officer," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir, First Lieutenant Mitchell. I'm qualified in general surgery and trauma medicine." Morrison nodded slowly. "You know what a surgical tent looks like when we get hit by artillery, Lieutenant? You know what happens when a man comes in with his legs blown off. You know how to keep working when you're covered in somebody else's blood." "I've trained for all of that, sir. Where are the surgical instruments?" Something in her straightforward refusal to be baited seemed to reach Morrison. His expression softened slightly. "Over here, I'll show you the setup. We usually work in pairs. I'll be honest with you, Lieutenant. Most of my staff aren't going to want to work with you at first. Not because you're a woman necessarily, because they're scared. They're scared of the fighting, scared of dying, scared of not being good enough to save lives. And sometimes fear makes men act stupid. But I've been a doctor too long to believe that a person's worth has anything to do with what's between their legs. It has to do with how steady their hands are and how clear their mind stays when everything's falling apart. I'm going to watch you work. If you're any good, I'll have you in the operating tent when we get busy. If you're not, I'll send you back to headquarters and tell them I tried. Fair." "Fair, sir," Sarah said. "Thank you for giving me the chance." That first day, there wasn't much to do. The fighting was still going on around them, but the base was a coordination point rather than a forward aid station. Sarah cleaned instruments, organized the medical supplies, and reviewed the procedures they had in place. She worked quietly and efficiently. When the other medical personnel came through, nurses, orderlies, and technicians, most of them avoided her or spoke to her only when necessary. But by the end of the day, Morrison found her and asked her to help him set up the main surgical table. They worked together in companionable silence, and Sarah could sense him watching how she moved, how she handled the instruments, how she understood the layout and efficiency of a surgical space. "You've done this before," he said finally. "Field work in North Africa, sir. I was attached to a forward surgical unit in Tunisia." "North Africa," Morrison nodded. "That explains it. You've already seen combat." "Yes, sir, plenty of it." "Then you know what's coming. When the Ruhr finally collapses, and it will soon, we're going to be slammed. Thousands of casualties, not just military, civilians too. The whole area's a mess." "I'm ready," Sarah said. Morrison looked at her for a long moment. "I believe you are, Lieutenant. I believe you are." The news came on April 16th. The German forces in the Ruhr pocket were formally requesting surrender. Roughly 500,000 soldiers, civilians, and German officers were now in American hands. The fighting was ending, but the chaos was just beginning. Suddenly, the base transformed. Vehicles arrived carrying wounded and injured prisoners of war, Germans with frostbite, malnutrition, and injuries from the fighting, Allied soldiers with fresh wounds from the final engagements, refugees from the surrounding towns, many of them hurt or sick. And mixed in with all of them were German officers, some still defiant, some broken, some terrified of what would happen to them now. The surgical tent became a constant stream of activity. Captain Morrison worked tirelessly, and he had Sarah in the operating room within hours of the first wave of casualties arriving. She proved herself immediately. Her hands were steady. Her judgment was sound. She made quick decisions and didn't hesitate or falter when things went wrong. The first serious moment came when a German soldier came in with a bullet wound in his abdomen and massive internal bleeding. Morrison was working on another patient. He looked at Sarah. "Can you handle this?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she replied. For the next 2 hours, Sarah operated alone while a German medical orderly, himself wounded but still able to assist, worked with her. The man was a trained medic named Klaus, who spoke broken English but understood surgical procedures. He watched Sarah work with a kind of amazement. "You are very good, doctor," he said quietly as they worked. "Very steady hand." "Thank you," Sarah replied, concentrating on the bleeding vessel in front of her. The German soldier survived. When Morrison checked on her progress halfway through, he nodded once and said, "Good work, Lieutenant." It was the first time anyone at the base had spoken to her that way. But word spread differently among the troops. Private Reeves was one of the first to mention it to her when he came through the medical tent with a minor infection on his hand. "You know what some of the guys are saying about you?" he asked awkwardly as Sarah treated his wound. "I imagine it's not very complimentary," she replied. "They're saying you're the one who should be doing all the surgeries. They're saying you're better than some of the doctors they've seen. There's this one sergeant, Sergeant Harris, he got wounded and you worked on him. He's been telling everyone you saved his life. Says you knew exactly what you were doing." Sarah didn't respond, but she felt something shift slightly inside. It wasn't validation. She knew her own competence and didn't need others to confirm it. But it was recognition, acknowledgement. It was the beginning of something changing. Over the next few days, as the base became even more crowded with prisoners and casualties, Sarah worked almost continuously. She slept in brief shifts on a cot in the medical tent. She worked alongside Captain Morrison and 3 other surgeons, and she gradually earned the respect of the orderlies and nurses. The German medical personnel who rotated through, working on German prisoners, watched her with a mixture of surprise and respect. "You are professional soldier, doctor," an older German physician named Dr. Henkel told her the first time they worked together on a German wounded man. "I can see this. Not like some of the Americans I have worked with. You understand the responsibility of this work." "Thank you, doctor," Sarah said. "And you are woman," he continued. "In Germany, we do not yet have this. Female doctors are not common. I did not expect to see this in American Army." Sarah looked at him. She'd been hearing similar sentiments in different forms for weeks, shocked that a woman would be here, mixed sometimes with respect and sometimes with contempt. But this older German doctor wasn't saying it with contempt. He was saying it with genuine observation. "What do you think of it?" she asked. "I think," Dr. Henkel said carefully, "that a good surgeon is a good surgeon. A bad one is bad one. I think that people who are afraid of change do not like seeing things that make them uncomfortable. But I am too old to be afraid, and you are too good at your work to ignore." By the 5th day of the surrender operations, something had shifted at the base. Sarah was no longer the woman they didn't want. She was the surgeon everyone wanted to have in the operating room during the worst cases. Captain Whitmore noticed this, and though he didn't apologize, his treatment of her became more respectful. He began asking her opinion on things, how many surgical units they'd need, what equipment was lacking, whether the current triage system was working efficiently. It was late evening on April 20th when the incident happened that would change everything. Sarah was in the surgical tent, finishing up with a German prisoner, a young man, maybe 19 years old, with a leg wound that had become infected. She'd cleaned it, removed the dead tissue, and given him antibiotics. He would recover, but he'd always walk with a limp. As she worked, a German officer, a major by his insignia, stood watching from the tent's entrance. He wore a dark Nazi uniform, and his eyes were hard and cold. Sarah had learned to read soldiers' faces, and she recognized the look of someone who still believed in what he'd been fighting for. When she finished and handed the patient off to be moved to the recovery tent, the officer stepped forward. "You are the female surgeon," he said in heavily accented English. "I am a surgeon, yes," Sarah replied. She didn't correct him on the female part. She'd learned that sometimes silence was more powerful than argument. "In Germany, we would not allow this," he said. "Women are not meant for men's work. It is weakness. The Führer understood this." Sarah was carefully packing her instruments. She didn't look at him. She'd heard variations of this sentiment before, from German prisoners, and she'd learned that engaging with the ideology never went anywhere useful. "Sir, this area is restricted," she said quietly. "You need to move back to the prisoner area." "You will not speak to me that way," the officer said. His voice rose. "I am a major, you are." "She's Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell," Captain Morrison said, appearing at the tent's entrance with 2 American soldiers. "And this is a medical area. Come on, Major. Let's get you back where you belong." The 2 soldiers took the German officer by the arms and led him away. He was shouting about the degeneracy of America, the stupidity of allowing women in the military, the inevitable comeback of German civilization. Captain Morrison looked at Sarah. "You okay?" "Yes, sir, I'm fine." "That's Major Friedrich Steiner. He's wanted by military intelligence for some things that happened at a processing camp near here. They're trying to decide what to do with him. He's going to be a problem before this is over. They're all going to be problems, the hard cases, the officers who can't accept that they lost." But you don't have to worry about them in here. This is a medical space. You're protected in here. Sarah nodded, but something in her had shifted. She'd been assuming this assignment was about proving herself to the American soldiers, about overcoming their prejudice. But there were other prejudices at work here, other hatreds. And this one had been leveled at her directly, in a way that felt personal, in a way the American soldiers' coldness never had. That night she lay on her cot and thought about why she'd become a doctor. It wasn't for praise or recognition. It wasn't to prove something to men who didn't believe in her. She'd become a doctor because she believed that every human being deserved the chance to live, to be treated with dignity and care. And she was good at it. She was very good at it. The next day she threw herself back into work with renewed focus. There was no time for reflection or doubt. The casualties kept coming, and Captain Morrison kept calling for her when the cases got complicated. By the end of the week, she'd assisted in or performed nearly 40 surgical procedures. She'd seen men die despite her best efforts. She'd also seen men live because of them. On April 25th, the formal surrender was complete. The Ruhr pocket had finally ceased to exist. The 500,000 German troops were now prisoners or being processed. The refugees were being moved to camps or returned to their homes. The fighting around them was essentially over. And Sarah Mitchell, the female officer nobody wanted, had become one of the most respected surgeons at the base. But the prejudice didn't disappear. It just transformed. Some soldiers resented her competence. Some officers were uncomfortable with taking orders or suggestions from a woman. And in the waiting areas and the barracks, the comments continued, though more quietly now and with an undercurrent of grudging respect. "She's a good surgeon," she heard Private Reeves say to another soldier, "but it's still not natural. Women belong at home." "Maybe," the other soldier replied, "but I wouldn't want anyone else working on me if I got hit." Sarah had learned that respect and acceptance were different things. She could earn the first. The second would take much longer. She also learned that the war might be ending, but the real struggles were just beginning. The questions of what to do with the German prisoners, how to handle the war criminals among the officers, how to rebuild the society that had been destroyed, these were all coming to the fore. And in the middle of it all, there was still work to do, still lives to save, still a job that needed doing, regardless of whether anyone thought she was the right person to do it. Sarah had never needed permission to matter. She was learning, day by day, that sometimes the world had to catch up to her own understanding of herself. The fall of the Ruhr pocket was complete. The German soldiers had laid down their arms. But for Sarah Mitchell, the real battle, the one for recognition, for respect, for the right to do what she was trained to do, was only just beginning. The morning briefing on April 28th brought new orders and new complications. Colonel Raymond Harrison, who oversaw the entire sector, came to the medical base personally to brief Captain Whitmore and his key staff. Sarah was invited to attend. A first, in some ways, though her presence still seemed to make certain officers uncomfortable. Colonel Harrison was a career military man in his 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a manner that suggested he'd seen enough of war to have opinions about everything. He stood at the head of the table in Whitmore's command tent and spread out maps showing the Ruhr area and the various prisoner of war camps that were being established. "We're facing a situation I'll be honest about," Harrison said. "We have roughly 500,000 enemy soldiers in custody. We have war crimes investigations ongoing. We have displaced persons from this region numbering in the hundreds of thousands. And we have limited resources to handle any of it. Medical resources in particular are severely stretched." He looked directly at Captain Morrison. "How are you managing?" "We're holding, sir," Morrison replied. "We have adequate personnel and supplies for now. Most of the acute cases have been stabilized. We're focused on preventing infection and managing long-term care for serious injuries." "And your staff?" Harrison asked. "I've heard good reports. Your surgical unit has been working miracles." "My staff is excellent, sir," Morrison said. His eyes flickered briefly toward Sarah. "The best I've had in this war." "Good, because I have a special assignment that I need your best people for. We're bringing in some prisoners who are suspected of involvement in war crimes. Concentration camp operations, specifically. We're working with military intelligence to identify them and document everything for the War Crimes Tribunal. These men need to be processed, interrogated, and prepared for prosecution. They'll likely be in various states of physical and mental health. They'll have injuries, malnutrition, disease. But more than that, they'll have He paused, looking for the word. Complication, psychological complication. War crimes investigation, Morrison said quietly. That's not medical work, sir. That's military intelligence and legal work. I know, Harrison replied. But the medical documentation is crucial. We need to establish their physical and mental state. We need to have professional medical documentation for the trials. I need a doctor who can be thorough, professional, and who can document these men without allowing their crimes to influence the medical assessment. In other words, a doctor who can treat them fairly while knowing exactly what they're suspected of. It's not an easy position. Sarah found herself speaking before she'd fully thought it through. When would you need this done, sir? Colonel Harrison turned to her with surprise, as if noticing her for the first time. And you are? First Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, sir, field surgeon. You're the female officer, Harrison said. It was stated as fact, not judgment. Yes, sir. Captain Morrison, is this officer qualified for this kind of work? Morrison considered the question carefully. Yes, sir, she's one of my best surgeons. She's also methodical, precise. She doesn't make assumptions. She sticks to what she can observe and verify. That's what I need, Harrison said. He looked back at Sarah. The work would begin tomorrow. You'd be working with a military intelligence officer named Major Thomas Brennan. The suspected war criminals would be brought into the medical examination facility we're setting up 2 miles from here. You'd conduct physical examinations, document their health status, and be available if any of them need medical attention. The intelligence people would do the interrogation separately. You'd have access to their medical records from German captivity and any information we have on them. Your job is pure medical assessment. Sarah's mind was already analyzing the situation. She understood what Harrison was asking for. He wanted a doctor who could treat these men professionally, who could acknowledge their crimes without allowing that knowledge to compromise the medical care, and who could be credible in a legal context, someone who couldn't be accused of bias or torture by medical neglect. I can do that, sir, she said. Good. Report to Major Brennan at 800 hours tomorrow at the intelligence facility. Captain Morrison, I'm requisitioning Lieutenant Mitchell's time for this assignment. Can you manage without her for at least 2 weeks? We can manage, sir, Morrison said. He looked at Sarah briefly, and she saw something in his expression that might have been concern or might have been pride. Lieutenant Mitchell is more than capable. The meeting ended, and as people filed out, Captain Whitmore pulled Sarah aside. You volunteered for this, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Why, it's going to be difficult work. It's going to make some people angry. There are soldiers here who lost friends to these camps. Some of them might think you're being too kind to men who deserve cruelty. Sarah considered her answer. Because someone needs to do it, sir. Because if we don't treat them fairly and document everything properly, we lose the ability to hold them accountable in court. And because, she paused, because I'm a doctor first, that has to mean something. Whitmore studied her. You're going to face a lot of anger, not just from soldiers, but from your fellow officers. A lot of people won't understand why a woman, why anyone, is treating Nazi war criminals with medical professionalism. I understand that, sir. All right then, good luck, Lieutenant, you're going to need it. The intelligence facility was located in a commandeered German military building, a concrete structure with reinforced walls and cells designed, ironically, for holding prisoners. Major Thomas Brennan was there to meet Sarah when she arrived at 800 the next morning. He was a compact man in his early 40s, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore military intelligence insignia and moved with the careful precision of someone trained in investigation and interrogation. First Lieutenant Mitchell, he said, shaking her hand professionally. Thank you for volunteering for this. I was assigned, sir. I didn't exactly volunteer. You did, according to Colonel Harrison. He said you spoke up when he was asking for medical personnel. That took courage. They walked down a corridor lined with cells. Some were occupied. Sarah could see men in various states of physical condition, thin from malnutrition, scarred, some with bandages, some with the look of people who'd been through horrors and couldn't quite process that they'd survived. What I need from you, Brennan said, is straightforward. These men are suspected of involvement in the operation of concentration camps, mass executions, medical experiments, some of the worst crimes imaginable. Our job is to identify them, verify their identity and service records, and document evidence. The interrogation is my job. The medical documentation is yours. I need you to examine each man thoroughly, document any physical evidence of their crimes or their military record, and prepare a medical report. What kind of physical evidence? Sarah asked carefully. Scars that might indicate they were military personnel or participated in specific operations. Evidence of disease or malnutrition that might tell us where they've been. Any distinguishing marks that might help us identify them or verify who they claim to be. And psychological assessment. Are they stable, suicidal, mentally competent for trial? They arrived at a medical examination room that had been set up in what had probably once been an officer's office. There was an examination table, basic medical instruments, and a chair where Sarah could sit to take notes. We'll bring them in one at a time, Brennan said. You examine them, document your findings. I'll be in the next room. If there's anything medically urgent, if someone's having a heart attack or about to harm themselves, you handle it. Otherwise, you just observe and document. How many men? Sarah asked. We're starting with 30. Suspected camp commandants, SS officers, medical personnel. We'll go from there. The first man came in at 8:30. He was in his late 50s, thin and scarred, with cold gray eyes that betrayed nothing. His name was Klaus Hartmann. According to the file Brennan provided, he was suspected of being commandant at a camp in Silesia that had seen over 10,000 deaths. Sit here, Sarah said, indicating the examination table. She kept her voice professional and neutral. Hartmann sat. He watched her with an expression that seemed almost amused, as if he found the whole process ridiculous. Sarah conducted the examination with methodical precision. Height, weight, general health assessment, detailed examination of any marks or scars on his body. She documented everything. She didn't comment on what the scars might indicate or where they might have come from. She simply recorded multiple small scars on left forearm consistent with shrapnel injuries. Scar tissue on right shoulder appears to be surgical in nature. Several healed fractures visible on left hand, suggesting previous trauma or mistreatment. She did the psychological assessment, asking him simple questions about his mental state, his comprehension, his emotional stability. The answers were all appropriate. He showed no sign of psychosis or immediate suicide risk. When the examination was complete, she said, "You can go back to your cell." Hartmann stood. As he was leaving, he looked back at her. "You are treating me like a human being," he said. "Like I am a person worthy of medical care. That is interesting, coming from a woman and coming from someone who clearly knows what I am suspected of. Why do you do this?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was already learning that anything she said would be used, analyzed, possibly used against her. "Because I'm a doctor," she said finally. "That's the only reason." Hartmann smiled, a thin, cold smile. "You are naive, perhaps, or you are strong. I have not yet decided which." He was led away, back to his cell. Over the next 3 hours, Sarah examined 5 more men. Each one was different. One was young, maybe 25, with the haunted eyes of someone who'd witnessed or participated in things that had broken him mentally. Another was older, in his 60s, and seemed almost unbothered by the whole process. One man was missing several fingers, apparently from frostbite or injury. Another was sick, fevered, and clearly unwell, and Sarah recommended that he be moved to the medical facility for observation. She documented everything without commentary. By lunchtime, she was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. The emotional weight of the work, the knowledge of what these men were suspected of, the requirement to treat them with professional medical care, was crushing. She sat alone in the cafeteria of the intelligence facility. Major Brennan joined her, carrying his own tray. "How are you holding up?" he asked, sitting across from her. "It's difficult," Sarah admitted. "Knowing what they're suspected of and then treating them professionally, it feels." She struggled for the word. "Wrong somehow, but I know it's necessary." "It is necessary," Brennan agreed. "And you're right that it's wrong in a way. That's the nature of what we're doing. We're establishing the facts, creating a record so that these men can be prosecuted through the legal system. If we abuse them, torture them, treat them unfairly, then we undermine the entire process. The defense will claim torture, will claim we're biased, will claim the evidence was gathered under duress. We lose credibility. We lose the ability to hold them accountable through justice. So we have to be fair. We have to treat them as human beings, even though they've committed inhuman acts." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because there's going to be pushback," Brennan said. There are soldiers here, good men who lost friends in the war or who saw what these camps did, who are going to be angry that we're treating these prisoners medically, fairly, with dignity. They're going to see it as a betrayal. They're going to see you as the woman treating them, and they're going to have strong reactions. I want you to understand before that happens why this work matters." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Is that going to be a problem? Will people interfere with the process?" "I don't think so. Colonel Harrison is personally overseeing this, and he's made it clear that the integrity of the process is paramount. But people will say things. They'll question your loyalty, your patriotism, your basic decency. That's just going to happen." "I understand," Sarah said. "Do you?" Brennan asked. "Because this is different from the surgical work you were doing. In surgery, you're clearly saving lives. The moral calculus is clear. Here, it's murky. You're providing care to men who caused immense suffering. Even if it's necessary, even if it's the right thing to do legally and ethically, it's going to feel wrong." Sarah realized that Brennan understood something essential about what he'd asked her to do. He wasn't just assigning her work. He was asking her to bear a particular kind of burden, the burden of maintaining humanity in the face of inhumanity. "I'll do the work," she said quietly. "Properly and thoroughly. Whatever comes after is something I'll have to manage." Over the following 2 weeks, Sarah examined 28 of the 30 suspected war criminals. She documented their physical condition, their psychological state, their distinguishing marks and medical history. She maintained professional distance and clinical precision, and slowly she began to understand the pattern of what she was seeing. Many of these men showed signs of recent mistreatment. They'd been through combat situations, some of them had been injured in the fighting, some were malnourished. But underneath that, there was something else. There was a kind of bureaucratic normalcy. These weren't men who seemed to see themselves as monsters. They were men who'd participated in evil but who seemed to compartmentalize it, to separate the things they'd done from their self-image. One man, a doctor named Heinrich Voss, was particularly striking in this regard. He was in his early 60s, with gentle hands and an intelligent face. According to the files, he was suspected of performing medical experiments on prisoners. When Sarah examined him, he discussed his own medical training with genuine enthusiasm, talked about research he'd been doing before the war, seemed like a perfectly normal academic physician. "You performed experiments on prisoners," Brennan said later, when they reviewed the case files. "Medical experiments that resulted in deaths and permanent injuries." "The evidence suggests it," Voss had said calmly. "I was following orders and conducting research that had military application. In Germany at that time, this was not considered unusual. It was considered the patriotic duty of a scientist." Sarah had documented his medical findings without comment. But afterward, in the privacy of her examination space, she'd sat for several minutes, simply thinking about the disconnect between what he'd done and how he seemed, educated, thoughtful, not obviously evil. It was after her examination of Dr. Voss that the first real confrontation came. She was walking back from the intelligence facility to the medical base when she encountered a group of soldiers near the camp's perimeter. There were about a dozen of them, and they'd clearly been drinking. One of them was Sergeant Harris, the man who'd been wounded and whom Sarah had operated on in the first days at the base. "There she is," Harris said, his words slightly slurred. "The doctor who wants to help the Nazis." Sarah kept walking, but Harris stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "I heard you're treating them," he said. "Treating them like they're human beings, like they don't deserve to be shot where they stand." "I'm treating them as medical patients," Sarah said, keeping her voice level. "Just like I treated you." "That's different," Harris said. "I'm American. These men murdered thousands of people, millions maybe, and you're giving them medicine and physical examinations like they matter." "They're human beings," Sarah replied. "And if we don't treat them fairly now, we undermine the legal process that will hold them accountable." "Legal process," Harris spat. "You know what legal process happened to the people in those camps? None. You know what medical treatment they got? Experiments. You know what you're doing. You're letting a Nazi tell you that they were just following orders, just doing their duty, and you're accepting that excuse." One of the other soldiers grabbed Harris's arm. "Come on, Sarge, let it go." "No," Harris said, shaking him off. "She needs to understand something. I was at the camp when we liberated it. I saw what they did. I saw what these people were capable of, and she's standing here telling me that we have to be fair to them." Sarah's heart was pounding, but her voice remained steady. Yes, we have to be fair, because that's what separates us from them. That's how we prove that we're the good guys. We don't torture them. We don't murder them in revenge. We treat them with the minimum humanity that the law requires, and then we hold them accountable through justice. That's the most naive thing I've ever heard, Harris said. Maybe, Sarah replied, but if it's naive, it's a naive that I believe in. She stepped around him and continued walking toward the medical base. As she walked away, she could hear Harris calling after her, making comments about women who didn't understand war, about idealistic nonsense, about the proper way to deal with Nazis. By evening, she knew the story had spread. There were looks in the medical tent, whispered conversations that stopped when she walked by. Private Reeves seemed to avoid her deliberately. Even some of the nurses who'd been warm to her seemed distant. Captain Morrison called her into his office after the evening shift ended. "I hear you had a confrontation with Harris," he said without preamble. "Yes, sir. He was upset about my work with military intelligence." "He's not the only one," Morrison said. He sat at his desk and gestured for her to sit across from him. "There are a lot of people who think what you're doing is wrong, that you're betraying the soldiers who died by treating the people responsible for their deaths with medical professionalism." "I understand that, sir, but the work has to be done." "I know it does," Morrison said, "and I support you, but Sarah, can I call you Sarah?" "Of course, sir." "Sarah, I need you to understand something. The reason I recommended you for this assignment was because I thought you were the right person. Professional, precise, able to maintain emotional distance. But I also knew it would be difficult, and I wasn't entirely prepared for how difficult it would be or how isolated you'd become." "I can handle it," Sarah said. "I know you can," Morrison replied. "But that doesn't make it fair that you have to. That's the thing about being a woman in this army. You don't just have to do the job. You have to do it perfectly, under worse conditions, with less support, and often without anyone understanding why you're doing it. And when people get angry with you, they're not just angry with you for your work. They're angry that you're a woman doing it." "That's not fair," Sarah said quietly. "No, it's not," Morrison agreed. "But it's true, so you need to decide, is this worth it? Is this assignment something you want to continue with, or do you want me to request that you be reassigned?" Sarah thought about the past 2 weeks. She thought about the men she'd examined, the documentation she'd created, the understanding she'd come to about the nature of the work. She thought about Sergeant Harris and his anger, his sense of betrayal. "I want to continue," she said. "Sir, I know it's unpopular, I know people are angry, but the work is important, and I believe in doing it." Morrison nodded slowly. "Then you're braver than I gave you credit for, because this is going to get harder before it gets better." Over the next week, the atmosphere at the base shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Sarah was no longer included in casual conversations among the officers. The nurses in the medical tent were polite but distant. Even Captain Morrison seemed to maintain a professional distance, though she could see in his eyes that he was watching to make sure no one actively harassed her. The work with military intelligence continued. Major Brennan brought her the final 2 suspects on May 5th. By this point, Sarah had examined and documented 28 men. She understood the patterns now, the different ways people justified what they'd done, the different psychological mechanisms used to compartmentalize evil. But the 29th suspect shattered her understanding of everything. His name was Obersturmbannführer Friedrich Steiner, the same officer who'd confronted her in the surgical tent weeks earlier, the one who'd railed against degeneracy and the weakness of allowing women in the military. When Sarah saw his file, she felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd treated him medically before. She'd heard his ideological rants, and now she was about to examine him in detail to document his physical and mental state. "There's something you should know about this one," Major Brennan said, as they prepared for the examination. "We have intelligence suggesting he was responsible for the execution of approximately 200 prisoners, soldiers, resistance, civilians, in the weeks before the German surrender. We also have evidence that he personally participated in the selection of victims for medical experimentation. We're trying to pin down the exact chain of command and his specific role, but he's one of the most significant suspects we have." Sarah's hands were shaking slightly as she put on fresh gloves. She hadn't been told about his specific crimes before she treated him in the surgical tent. And now, knowing what he was suspected of, she had to maintain her professional composure and examine him as she would any other patient. Steiner was brought in by military guards. He looked thinner than he had before, exhausted, but his eyes still held that same cold certainty. When he saw Sarah, something flickered across his face, recognition and something else. Amusement, perhaps, or satisfaction. "The female surgeon," he said. "How interesting. They have assigned me to you for examination." "Sit here," Sarah said, keeping her voice neutral and professional. Steiner sat. As Sarah began the examination, she was aware of every sensation, the tension in her own body, the coldness of his skin, the way he watched her with that same contemptuous expression. She began with standard measurements and observations. Then she moved to the detailed physical examination. It was during this that she found it, a mark on his left forearm. A faint scar tissue, but underneath it, visible if you looked closely, the faded mark of a tattoo. "What's this?" she asked, indicating the mark. "Old wound," Steiner said. "From my time in the SS, I tried to remove a marking. It was an identifying mark I no longer wanted." Sarah understood immediately. The SS had tattoos identifying their blood type. They could be removed surgically, or they could be burned off or deliberately scarred over. This scar tissue pattern was consistent with deliberate removal. She continued the examination without comment, documenting everything precisely. When she finished, she said, "You can go back to your cell." But as Steiner stood to leave, Sarah spoke again. "Your claim is that you tried to remove an SS identification mark. I'd recommend military intelligence ask you about that. When it happened, why it happened, and whether you were trying to hide your identity from Allied forces." Steiner's expression hardened. For a moment she saw genuine anger cross his face, the first real emotion he'd shown. Then the mask returned. "You are a doctor, not an interrogator," he said coldly. "I'm both right now," Sarah replied. "And as a doctor, I'm documenting what I observe. What you do with that information is not my concern." After he was taken back to his cell, Major Brennan came to talk to her immediately. "The scar tissue on his forearm," he said. "You're suggesting it's from removal of an SS blood type tattoo." "Yes, sir. The scar pattern is consistent with that. And his story about it being from an old wound doesn't match the location or the appearance." Brennan was quiet for a moment, thinking. If he deliberately removed his SS identification, it suggests he was trying to hide his SS service, which means he was trying to evade identification as a war criminal, which means he knew what his actions had qualified as. That's significant. "Yes, sir. You did good work," Brennan said. "That observation, the connection between the physical evidence and the psychological implication, that's exactly the kind of thing that builds a case. That's the kind of thing that holds up in a war crimes tribunal." "I was just doing what I'm trained to do," Sarah said, observing carefully. "Yes, and that's what makes you valuable," Brennan replied. "You're not agenda-driven, you're not angry at these men, you're just precise. That precision is worth more than a dozen angry soldiers seeking revenge." That afternoon, word somehow leaked that Sarah had identified something significant about Steiner. She wasn't sure how it happened. Perhaps Major Brennan had mentioned it to military intelligence personnel, or perhaps one of the guards had overheard. But by evening, the dynamic had shifted again. Sergeant Harris approached her as she was leaving the medical tent. "I heard you got something on Steiner," he said. His tone was cautious, almost apologetic. "I documented what I observed," Sarah replied. "That's all." "Yeah, but it was something important. That's what I heard. Something that helps prove what he did." "I don't discuss my findings with enlisted personnel," Sarah said, though not unkindly. "But if you want to know details, you can ask Major Brennan." Harris nodded. He seemed to want to say something else, but instead he just nodded again and walked away. That evening, when Sarah went to the officers' mess for dinner, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Officers who'd been avoiding her actually acknowledged her presence. Someone asked her how her work was going. Private Reeves, who'd apparently joined some of the other soldiers in giving her the cold shoulder, brought her coffee and apologized for being a jerk lately. It struck Sarah, sitting there in the mess tent, that what she'd done, simply observing and reporting a detail about a suspected war criminal's scar tissue, had somehow rehabilitated her standing. The soldiers could understand her now, not as an idealist trying to be fair to Nazis, but as someone helping to hold Nazis accountable. The complexity of this troubled her deeply. She hadn't changed how she was doing her work. She was still treating these men fairly, still maintaining professional medical standards, still providing care to suspected war criminals. What had changed was that people now saw her work as having produced results they approved of. Captain Morrison called her into his office after dinner. "Sit down," he said, and there was something in his tone that made her tense up. "What's wrong, sir?" she asked, taking a seat. "Nothing's wrong. In fact, something's right, and I want to talk to you about it," Morrison said. He set down a folder on his desk. "I've been reviewing the medical reports you've been submitting to military intelligence. The documentation is excellent, thorough, precise, professional, and more importantly, I see what happened with the Steiner identification. You connected something medical, a scar pattern, with something investigative. You did that because you're a good observer, and because you understand how to read a human body." "I was just doing my job, sir." "I know you were," Morrison said. "But here's the thing. What you've been doing these past 2 weeks, maintaining fairness and professionalism while examining men suspected of terrible crimes, that's hard. It's emotionally difficult, and it's also incredibly important work. I've been watching how you're handling it, and I want to tell you something." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "When I first heard they were assigning a female surgeon to this unit," he continued, "I was skeptical. I'd worked with competent female physicians before, but this was a combat zone, and I wasn't sure how it would work. Then I watched you in surgery, and I saw that you were good, really good. But it wasn't until these past 2 weeks that I understood how good you actually are. You're not just technically skilled, you're morally sophisticated. You understand that doing the right thing isn't always easy or popular, and you do it anyway." Sarah didn't know what to say. She felt tears pricking at her eyes, which surprised her. She'd been so focused on maintaining composure that she hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that her work mattered, that her presence mattered. "Thank you, sir," she managed. "You're going to keep getting pressure," Morrison said. "Even though the situation with Steiner has helped your standing, there are still people who resent the fact that you're here and doing well. But I want you to know that you have my complete support. And if anyone gives you serious trouble, I want you to come to me." "Yes, sir, I will." Morrison was quiet for a moment. "Your parents know what you're doing." "I haven't told them details, sir. I've written that I'm doing medical work here. I haven't explained what that means." "You should," Morrison said. "Because when this is all over, when the trials happen, when this work is documented in the public record, people are going to see what you did. They're going to see that you're a woman who helped document and build cases against some of the worst people in this war. That's going to be your legacy, and your parents should know that." Sarah thought about her parents, her father, who'd been skeptical of her going to medical school, her mother, who'd worried about her joining the military. What would they think when they understood not just what she'd done, but why she'd done it? "I'll write to them, sir," she said. The 31st and final suspected war criminal came 2 days later. His name was Klaus Hoffmann, and according to the files, he was a younger man, only 31 years old, who'd served as an officer in the camp administration. He wasn't suspected of personally committing executions or medical experimentation, but rather of overseeing the logistical operations of the camp, prisoner assignments, food distribution, work details. When Sarah examined him, she found a man who seemed almost broken by the reality of his situation. Unlike some of the other officers, he didn't seem to be in denial. He seemed to understand on some level that he'd participated in evil. "I didn't pull any triggers," he said to her as she was completing the examination. "I didn't participate in the selection process for experiments, but I knew, everyone who worked there knew." Sarah didn't respond. She was documenting his physical condition and psychological state, not having a conversation about his guilt or innocence. "I didn't want this," Hoffmann continued. "I was drafted into the SS. I didn't agree with the ideology, but I participated anyway because the alternative was death. Does that matter?" "That's not a question I can answer," Sarah said quietly. "That's something the tribunal will have to determine." After the examination, she provided her report to Major Brennan. Hoffmann was psychologically coherent, showed no signs of psychosis or immediate suicide risk, but was clearly experiencing significant emotional distress and possible depression. Medically, he was in relatively good health despite malnutrition. "He's interesting," Brennan said. "He's not denying what happened. He's not claiming he was just following orders in the way that the others are, but he's also not trying to present himself as a hero or a leader. He just seems broken." "Do you think he's sincere?" Sarah asked. I think he's telling himself a story about not having choice, Brennan replied, which might be partially true or might be entirely self-deceptive. That's for the courts to figure out, but medically speaking, your assessment is what I need, and you've provided it. With Hoffman's examination, Sarah's work with military intelligence was essentially complete. She'd examined and documented all 30 men. Brennan indicated that the case files would now be sent to headquarters for review and preparation for the War Crimes Tribunal. "You've done excellent work, Lieutenant," Brennan said when they met for the last time. "Truly, this documentation is going to be valuable in the tribunal. These men are going to be held accountable partly because you observed carefully, treated them fairly, and reported what you found accurately. That matters." "What will happen to them?" Sarah asked. "The formal trials will happen in Nuremberg," Brennan said. "That's where the major trials will be, but cases like these, camp officers, mid-level SS, will be tried in military courts or in German courts after the occupation. Some will be convicted and executed. Some will be convicted and imprisoned. Some might be acquitted, though I doubt it. The evidence is solid. Your documentation is part of that." "And the ones who are executed?" Sarah asked. Brennan was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if that will bother you or not, whether you'll feel some responsibility for their deaths, since you documented evidence that helped convict them." "They're not responsible for their deaths," Sarah said quietly. "They're responsible for their own actions. If those actions resulted in executions, that's on them." "I know that intellectually," Brennan said. "I just wanted to make sure you did too, because there will be moments, I think, when you remember their faces or remember conversations you had with them, and you'll wonder if you should have done something different. Just know that you did what was right. You did what was necessary. That has to be enough." The war in Europe officially ended on May 8th. VE Day came with celebration throughout the base, soldiers cheering, some of them crying with relief, music playing into the night. But for Sarah, it felt surreal. The fighting had ended, but the moral complexity remained. The men she'd examined and documented were still in custody. Their fates were still undetermined. The work wasn't over, it was just transitioning into a different form. She was reassigned back to the medical unit under Captain Morrison's command. Within days, her old surgical unit was being reduced. Most of the casualties from the combat operations had been either stabilized or had died. The urgent medical need was diminishing. Slowly, soldiers began rotating back to the United States or being reassigned to occupation duties in Germany and other parts of Europe. Sarah expected to be reassigned as well, but when she asked Captain Morrison about it, he seemed to have other plans. "I'm requesting that you stay," he told her. "At least for another month. We're establishing a more permanent medical facility here, and I want you to help set it up. We need someone who understands both trauma surgery and general medical care. Someone who can train other physicians. You're the best candidate I have." "Of course, sir," Sarah replied. "I'll stay." But the decision meant she was one of a small number of women remaining at the base. Most of the female personnel, nurses, administrative staff, support personnel, were being rotated out. That left Sarah more visible, more isolated in some ways, but also more valued. It was during this period that the first real consequence of her work with military intelligence became clear. In mid-May, Colonel Harrison came to the medical facility with Major Brennan and two other officers Sarah didn't recognize. They asked to speak with her privately. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Harrison said, once they were in Morrison's office with the door closed, "we need to ask you some questions about your work on the war crimes documentation." Sarah's stomach tightened. "Of course, sir, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong exactly," one of the unfamiliar officers said. He was a major in military intelligence with sharp features and an expression of skeptical assessment. "We're just verifying some details. I'm Major Reeves, no relation to Private Reeves, I'd assume, and this is Captain Marks. We're with the Judge Advocate General's office. We're preparing the cases for trial, and we need to verify certain details in the medical documentation." "I'm happy to help, sir," Sarah said. "When you examined Obersturmbannführer Steiner," Major Reeves said, "you documented what appeared to be a deliberate removal of an SS identification tattoo. You noted that the scar pattern was consistent with deliberate scarring over or surgical removal.